Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar on cost cutting during COVID-19. My name is Abel Delgado. I am the Digital Marketing Director of America's Market Intelligence, and I'm going to be serving as the moderator for today's webinar presentation. Before we get started, I just want to give you a quick rundown of what to expect today. The presentations last about an hour or so. We'll have about 40 to 50 minutes of material that's presented, and then the space for questions. Now, sometimes our webinars can go a little longer than that because people will send us a lot of questions, and we'll be happy to answer as many as we can. So if that happens, we probably will stay on extra time, and if you can stay with us, that's great. If not, that's fine as well. You can ask us a question at any point in time during the webinar. The way to do that is if you look at your screen, you're going to see sort of a rectangular panel, sort of as an attendee here, and basically there's going to be a series of icons, and one of them is going to have Q&A on it. So you basically click on that. It brings up a window, and then that allows you to then type your question into the window and hit enter, and we'll receive it. One of the big questions we always get during the webinar itself is, are the materials going to be available? So let's answer that up front right now. Yes, they absolutely are going to be available. The way that we do it is within 24 to 48 hours of the webinar actually taking place, we send an email to all of our registrants with the material so they can access the video and also have the presentation slide. So definitely that material will be available to you. All right, we're also going to ask you a couple of questions during the webinar, so we just want you to be aware of that. Those are poll questions that we basically use to understand how you feel about some of the issues that we're talking about today. So we'll announce those when those come up, and it's pretty straightforward in terms of the participation. Let's move on. Here we have coming up is our legal notice. And here, I'm not going to read that because it just takes too long to go over. But essentially what this covers is our level of liability with the information presented today. So I encourage you to read that at your leisure. And that's basically that. Now we get to the introduction of our speakers. First off, we're going to have our lead speaker, John Price, who is the founder and the managing director of America's Market Intelligence. Also, Ricardo Alvarez, who is the director of our consumer services practice. Then we have Diego Rodriguez, the director of our logistics practice. And finally, last but not least, Lindsay Lear, the director of our payments practice. Now, this brings us to our first poll. As you can see it up there on the screen, but I'm going to launch it now so it'll take up your screen and you can sort of see the options here. So that should be occupying the screen, and what you would basically do is look at your options and just pick one by clicking on it, and that would allow you to then participate in the poll, and we'll accumulate the results in real time. So this first question, as you can see, is in which Latin American country are you expecting the largest cutbacks in 2020 or 2021 in terms of percentages? So we have a number of different options here. We have 7 countries up here: Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, and of course we have other to cover other markets in the event that your cuts are not going to be happening in those particular markets, at least the largest ones. So we're tabulating the results now. I'll try to get an answer here as far as that's concerned. We like to do that in real time. It takes about 50 seconds, so we're just making sure that everyone has had a chance to participate, and then we'll be sharing the results with you shortly. All right. Should be interesting to see if this falls within the major markets or not. All right, it's been about a minute, so let's close that poll and let's share the results here so you can see. So it's not entirely surprising. Brazil, being the largest market, is #1 in this aspect. 35% expect the largest percentage cuts to happen there, followed by Mexico. So those are the 2 largest markets. And then it's tracking normally also because we have Argentina with 19%. With Chile and Colombia, actually not much at all, 0 and 2% respectively. And then, of course, you have 0% for Peru, 4% for Ecuador, and 8% for other. All right, well, thank you very much for participating. Really appreciate that. Now, let's keep this presentation moving. I'm going to turn the floor over to John Price to talk a little bit more about the services that are related to what we're discussing here today. John.
Thanks, Abel, and welcome, everyone. Many of you have attended some of our previous COVID-themed webinars. This is, in fact, our 11th in total. This one is a little bit different. This one is a little bit more, if you like, actionable. Most of ours have been of an informative nature where we are providing you with our best estimates of where either the crisis is going from a healthcare perspective, but more generally, where we see each of our industry practices and those industries going over the next year through COVID. Today, what we wanted to share with you were some lessons that we've learned having gone through economic crises in the past. And as you can see, this is a sort of a rundown of some of the things that we do for our clients. And most of the time, of course, we are helping companies in an expansion mode deepen their penetration of Latin American markets, defend their assets, defend their market positions by gathering information either from their customers, the competition, or helping them understand the business context, i.e. the economics and the regulatory environment. But there are crises every few years in Latin America, and so we have developed services specifically to help companies during these difficult times, whether it's trying to decide where to cut costs, where to lower funding, whether it's on products that are much less relevant in a crisis than in a growth stage, channels that are being underutilized, which is very relevant with COVID, or markets that are particularly underperforming versus others. Also, a lot of strategic plans that were formulated in the last year or even 2 years ago, of course, are no longer relevant. So we spend a lot of time helping companies reformulate their strategic plans by helping them reestablish the assumptions of the marketplace that underpin those plans. And of course, everybody's trying to defend their market share, whether it's from value focused competitors who are more price competitive in an environment like this, disruptive competitors, or what is relevant in some categories of products and services, the gray and black markets, which can be prominent in some areas of Latin America. So we are going to today talk about these issues and share with you some of the learnings that we've had. Abel, let's move forward. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of how research can help drive and make more strategic your cost cutting, we wanted to give you a brief snapshot of where we see the region right now with the COVID crisis. When the COVID crisis began and we sat down with leaders of Latin American divisions of multinationals, as well as leaders of Multilatinas, they were almost unanimous in declaring that they had no plans to lay people off. They were looking for cost savings elsewhere in their operations. But now we're 5 months into this crisis. And the fact is that most companies who might have been hoping for a V-shaped recovery in Latin America are losing hope of that eventuality and therefore are looking to cut costs. And that's why we thought we would time this webinar, because we think it's the end of the first half of the year is a point in time in which a lot of companies are reassessing their performance this year, as well as looking ahead at their prospects for the second half of the year. So we were told by several this would be a good time for this. This slide is quite controversial and is based upon an article that we published in Perspectiva, our thought leadership newsletter that goes out every month. You can find it on our website in the Insight sections. It's called, in much of Latin America, COVID will burn out before vaccines arrive. And basically, I won't go into too much in depth here, but basically we've taken upon ourselves to try to forecast the progress, if you like, for lack of a better word, of COVID from a healthcare standpoint and where it was likely to burn out in certain countries versus others. And as you can see, there's quite stark differences from country to country. Again, this is going to be important because come late September or in October, we will publish our forecast for 2021 across the region. We will do a webinar, as we usually do every year, of our forecast. And this kind of healthcare forecast will have some weight in how we see the region economically next year. On the next slide, you'll see our forecast economically of the region. Generally speaking, smaller, geographically smaller countries, population-wise smaller countries, have had an easier time dealing with COVID, whether it was truly containing it or, in the case of island nations and Uruguay and Paraguay, or whether it was keeping the economic impacts more limited. The larger countries have had a tougher time obviously containing the virus. And as you can see, related back to that previous slide, countries like Peru, which are further along, if you like, towards herd immunization than other countries, they will suffer more dramatically this year economically, but will also rebound more dramatically next year. On the next slide, we look at the world through the eyes of corporate sectors. And for many of you who follow, particularly the US stock markets, you know that certain sectors have done extremely well during COVID, both because of actual performance as well as anticipated shifts in the marketplace that will favor these companies going forward. So whether it's information technology firms like Microsoft and Apple, e-commerce players like Amazon, automotive players like Tesla, basic consumer services that have a strong online delivery component to them like Netflix. These sectors are doing well. Unfortunately, these sectors are not strong in Latin America. They may sell well in Latin America, but those companies are not based in Latin America. In fact, that circle graph on the left relates to the 100 best performing market cap companies in the world. Only one of them is based in Latin America, Mercado Libre. On the right, you see a listing of the top 100 market cap corporations in Latin America. And as you can see, they're concentrated in energy, brick and mortar retail, not online retail, brick and mortar retail, mining and metals, automotive, agri-food. With the exception of agri-food, which is done reasonably well in COVID, the other ones have not done well, generally speaking. So this is another reason behind Latin America's underperformance versus the rest of the world during COVID. On the next slide, we come to the next poll question. And before we delve into areas of research and areas of cost cutting that our research helps companies strategize on, we'd like to ask you the question, what's your biggest priority as you look to cut costs going forward? And some of the questions are related to, say, a strategic way of looking at cost cutting, the first 5. Do you want to change your product and service portfolio as you cut costs? Do you want to change your channel strategy? Reduce input costs from vendors, including transportation? Do you plan to change your promotional mix and look for cost cutting there? Are you going to narrow or change your target customer demographics and look for cost cutting in that way? Or are you looking to reduce costs evenly across your organization so that you can be well positioned to, when the market returns to normal, entre comillas, at the end of the pandemic? So we're very curious to know what your answers are here. So this is very interesting. There's a huge emphasis on 2 areas. One is evenly reducing costs. And frankly, that is how the majority of companies look at cost cutting for 2 reasons, or a couple of reasons. One is the belief that things will return to normal. A second belief is they want to be equitable. This is a painful period, so a lot of companies try to be equitable in terms of how they cut costs and keep people motivated as a result. And another reason, of course, is just the politics, the difficulty. In some parts of Latin America, it's very difficult to move forward with layoffs. It's expensive. And if you're looking for short-term liquidity, it can actually hurt your cash flow more to lay people off than to keep them employed. And not surprisingly, the focus on changing sales channels. For a lot of companies in Latin America, they were underexposed in online selling, reliant upon traditional sales channels. And of course, there's a mad scramble to change that mix. So there's no surprises there. Okay, let's move forward. So again, we want to share some of the lessons that we've learned, and let's turn to the next slide. We sat down as a company on March 18th for our own internal strategizing as to how we were going to react to the COVID crisis. And the 11 webinars that we produced is part of that response. We decided we wanted to keep our customers and our wider audience of followers informed as best as we could, relying upon our strengths of information gathering and our contacts in key industries where we operate. And we also, reflected and looked back and said, well, we've been down this road before. This crisis is different in nature in some ways, but economically, there's some of the same patterns we've seen before. And in fact, this is the 6th economic crisis that we have navigated in Latin America. This is by far the most disruptive. And I say that because if you look on the right, all of these areas, customers, who your target customers are, customers that have disappeared, new customers that have appeared, the channels through which you sell, the products that are relevant versus the ones that were relevant just 3 and 4 months ago, the vendors, who you can work with, who's still in business, and how you need to collaborate with them is changing. And of course, there are regulation changes that have already occurred and many more that will likely occur based upon the economic impact of this crisis. But we've also seen disruptions before. Very disruptive was the tequila crisis in Mexico, as well as the crisis in 2001 in Argentina. And this crisis will be no less disruptive. And on the next slide, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Ricardo, who will walk us through some very interesting insights related to consumers and channels.
Thank you very much, John. What we have learned in our survey of people in quarantine under COVID is there's been a real shift in customer segmentation as well as channel sales prioritization. When we survey consumers in Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico, one of the interesting segments that we have found were those who were feeling stronger and reading fine. And in fact, these people are particularly resilient because it is not fortunate circumstances that have made them feel stronger, but actually unfortunate circumstances. Many of them have lost their job, or their income levels have been hurt by COVID. Many of them are business owners in the informal economy outside of the home, and those businesses are not easily transferable to home. And a disproportionate number of them are women. More than half of those were single moms. So these are some of the hardest working people in Latin America today. These women raise their children, they run their own business. Most of them are financially independent, and they have been off the radar for a lot of brands because most of their consumption patterns were through informal cash markets. Now, COVID changed that code for some online. COVID had forced them into the formal economy, so suddenly they have appeared on the radar of marketers now, and that's a very interesting development. And of course, purchasing online is becoming imperative for everybody. Some already were accustomed to buy online. Others, like other group ages, just described, were completely unaccustomed. They buy online. But today, everybody is purchasing more online. So these are two disruptive examples of new consumer segments merging. And of course, the ascendancy of online is a very important channel. We go to the next slide, please. In this chart, we are providing some recommendations for a process that can be followed to optimize cost reductions. As a basic principle, the spirit or philosophy of any cost reduction effort is that it must be focused on improving the overall customer experience. If you're going to cost cut to diminish the experience of the customer, I don't think it's going to be a good decision. The impact of all the changes must be related of improving things like loyalty and generating preference versus your competition. In this chart, I have put in red color some actions that we recommend to do. Whatever you do in this process, you will need to conduct some kind of market research, use internal and external data, either structured or unstructured. If you have your client list, you can use it to analyze patterns or consumer pattern behavior. That is structured information. Or if you have unstructured information, such as the recordings of your call center of customers complaining about deficiencies of a service or congratulating the service, that is unstructured information, and that can be analyzed as well. Videos also can be analyzed. What I am suggesting here is not only the usage of traditional research methods, but the new methodologies that technology is providing today, like machine learning and natural language process technology that is available in Latin America. In conclusion, the customer has changed not only on the what, the why, and the how. They also have changed the way they consume media. And it's time to readapt our strategy to our new times. Now I'm going to leave you with my colleague Diego Rodriguez, who is going to talk to you about logistics.
Thank you, Ricardo. And before I talk about logistics, I want to remind the audience that at the bottom of your screens, you have the Q&A section where you can post your questions to us after we finish our presentation. We will open up the floor to answer some of your questions. So please don't be shy and hit us with your best questions. So now moving on to the logistics section, I want to get your attention real quick by mentioning one really successful case study about cutting costs and becoming more nimble, more efficient in the logistics industry. Recently, a couple of years ago, we performed a study for a global CPG. And in that cost-cutting study, we were able to save for this client $1 million a year. $1 million a year for an investment that costs probably $60,000. It's pretty profitable, right? So when we did this, the idea was to focus on finding our alternatives and finding ways to save money by becoming more efficient, by looking at how the competitors are interacting with their vendors. And this is critical, looking at the smartest competitors in the field to know what they're doing, how they're dealing with their vendors, how they're implementing new strategies in their operations to reduce costs. Because to be honest, during times of fat cows and expansion mode, companies tend to forget about efficiency, about the bottom line, and we're just thinking about pursuing and finding new customers. But in times of crisis, we need to find ways to become more efficient. And there's a quote that just came to my mind, and is about, we should never let a crisis go to waste. And what I mean by that is basically finding ways and finding actions that before we thought that we were not able to do as individuals and as companies. And that's my invitation for all of you to think about what were what things you were not able to do in the past, and what things you consider are out of the box that can help your companies and your departments or your areas to become more efficient. And to talk about this example that I'm mentioning about cost cutting, the methodology we use basically combined two key elements. The first one was to do competitive intelligence to look at the smartest competitors in the field, and then to identify an optimal cost structure for our client. Basically, we follow the Walmart method of vendor optimization. Most of you might be familiar with it. For those who are not familiar, basically it's a concept where Walmart studies the cost structure of leading suppliers and recommends ways for them to cut costs. And that's where CPG client did with its trucking companies in Argentina, in Chile, and South America in general. They were finding ways to tell their vendors to become more efficient, and in that way their operation will be more efficient. So that's basically the strategy. And moving on to the next slide, Abel, thank you so much. Basically, the alternatives and the avenues that we found to save money and where the $1 million savings were located were basically in 4 pockets. But let's not think only about transportation, which is a critical element in any company, especially for e-commerce or retailer firms. Transportation is probably one of the largest expenses, including also warehousing and logistics services. But this can also be applied to other type of vendors, other type of services that you believe you're overpaying your vendors. And this is the time to negotiate and to leverage the crisis to lower your vendors' rates. And to finalize this case study, basically, where we found opportunities to save money by looking at the competitors and looking to their best practices. That's basically the way that we did it, looking in terms of how they were measuring the vehicle rotation in their fleets. And by doing this, we recommended creating a vehicle rotation index where that would provide the key metrics to periodically assess the fees paid to the trucking firms. That was key to identify the productivity of the fleet of the trucking companies servicing the CPG. Second element was use 30 pallet fleets for long haul trips to move more cargo at the same cost. Also, we recommended the CPG to encourage its trucking vendors to invest in a fleet capable of moving 30 pallets. And basically, if today it's hard to force your trucking company or your trucking vendor to invest money in new fleets, but if you're able to identify who are the best providers in your country, in your market with these type of fleets, you can switch and go and save money in that way. So that's another bucket and another opportunity. Third was finding ways to reduce unneeded space at cross-docking facilities. We identified that the amount of space that was underutilized or sometimes just sitting idle in a cross-docking facility for our client was extremely high, and they were paying to their 3PL for that space. So when you're able to have a better communication with your customers and with your vendors in terms of the capacity and the need that you required in your warehousing and cross-docking facilities, I'm pretty sure you will be able to find some opportunities to save money. And finally, the last recommendation, and this is prevalent across Latin America, is the excessive use of driver's assistance. Driver's assistance can become a very expensive cost at any last mile delivery operation. And what we did was recommending the CPG client to review the need based upon the customer needs. Sometimes your customers don't require or have the technology to only use the driver in the unloading or the loading operations. And also encourage the CPG to find trucking providers that were able and had fleets using technology that removed the need for a driver assistant. And in those 4 buckets, again, we were able to save the CPG company $1 million a year. So that's the message. Don't let this crisis go to waste. Be smart, think outside the box. And of course, AMI is ready to support you and help you in these strategies in identifying opportunities to save money and to cut costs in your operations. Having said that, I will pass the baton to my colleague, Lindsay Lear, and I will be ready to answer your questions. Bye.
Thanks, Diego. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. So glad you could be here with us. I'm Lindsay Lear. I lead the payments practice at AMI. And today, just like my colleagues, I'm going to address 4 key principles that can help us cut costs in the payments industry and probably in other industries as well. The first speaks to primarily transparency and simplicity. Why these 2 principles? First of all, your cost-cutting strategy is going to vary depending upon what role you play in the payments value chain, right? But getting these principles down will probably help you no matter what position you're in. So number 1, transparency. We all know that the payments industry, the payments value chain, the payments processing process is quite opaque. It varies between countries. Sometimes it's regulated, sometimes it's not. And the more visibility you can get into how that value chain breaks down, the more power you will have to leverage yourself and have a successful negotiation with your suppliers. So if you're a merchant, for example, paying payment processing fees, there are a lot of different models on how acquirers and processors assess those fees that are common in the United States, not so much in Latin America, simply because acquirers it hasn't been demanded yet of the acquirers by the merchants. So for example, interchange plus pricing, in which you clearly see the cost that you're paying and the markup that you're being charged. So merchants can insist on payment processing cost transparency to try to figure out, am I overpaying? Am I really receiving the value that I'm paying for? And can I get any additional leverage? Similarly, for acquirers, aggregators, payment service providers, anyone on the processing side, if you're looking to move into a new country or want to improve your competitive space within your current market, really understanding the acquiring landscape, the processing landscape, what players are where, and how that value is broken up between those players helps you get the shortest and most direct line to getting those payments processed, and again, making sure your costs are competitive and that you're in the most competitive place within that value chain. Number 2 would be aiming for automation and simplicity. And this one is more on the issuer side, those who are consumer facing. In an environment in which everyone's pocketbooks are low on cash, automation and maximum efficiency will help us get ahead. And this is a trend that has been accelerating for some years now with respect to automation. And now more than ever, it's critical that banks and others have a really excellent automated customer service system in place, utilizing chatbots, utilizing AI and machine learning in their call centers to not only automate your customer service, but make sure it's really of high quality and making your customer feel really secure and well attended to. Making sure for banks that you're able to acquire and onboard new customers digitally. This is absolutely critical nowadays. Many banks in the region still do not have a seamless acquisition channel over mobile or over online banking. So this is an area where some banks may be falling behind in competitiveness and will save you money today in the short term and the long term. And issuers are, now that we are experiencing this massive digital acceleration because of COVID-19, issuers are starting to rethink their physical infrastructure. Do I really need this enormous branch network? What does the branch of the future look like? Can I repurpose or leverage some of my infrastructure to help me be in the best position going forward? So automation and simplicity being the principle number 2. If we go ahead to the next slide. Number 3 would be adjusting your product focus. You want your product focus to be most aligned with what is growing right now and who is disrupting the industry. Ricardo mentioned the consumer group that is most disrupting e-commerce right now are women, particularly single women who have families and maybe run their own business. We want to make sure that our efforts and our investments in products and marketing are aligned with what is growing. So, of course, our affluent and our traditional customer base remains important because they drive a lot of consumption for us still. But we don't need to be promoting or investing in travel cards, in corporate cards, and some of these products that have been very strategic for us in the past and right now simply aren't relevant to people's lives. It's really critical, as Ricardo mentioned this as well, to do a very careful resegmentation of your cardholders and your customer base. Understand who they are. Understand at a new level what are the problems they're facing in their lives under COVID-19 that you can solve, that you can help alleviate when you're thinking about your rewards programs and loyalty programs. We want to make sure that they're aligned very strategically to be highly relevant and purposeful for who our customers look like today. And for all companies, company types in the payments industry and beyond, we want to make sure that while we're looking at cost cutting, we are simultaneously holding in our minds a long-term perspective. John mentioned that this is potentially the most disruptive crisis we've seen in the region in the past 20 years that we've been in this business. And when something is highly disruptive, that means permanent change is coming. So we want to cut costs now, put in some of these practices to cut costs, but let's not lose sight of the long-term and permanent changes that will affect our industry and make very selective and strategic investments that will set us up for long-term growth. So in the payments industry, what technology, what capital investments specifically in technology do we need to be making to make sure that we have maximum efficiency and that we're aligned with growth trends? So, things like machine learning, artificial intelligence, digital acquisition, these things cost money. Customer segmentation, reworking your rewards programs, these things are investments that will help us be aligned with industry trends going forward so that we don't fall behind once things stabilize and normalize. And finally, again, in line with that long-term perspective is making sure that we're taking care of our newly digitized customers. We're seeing the biggest provoker of digitization that we've seen in the past 10 years. And we need to make sure that, as Diego said, let's not waste this crisis. Let's take full advantage of this moment to bring new consumers and merchants into the digital fold and keep them there. That means driving new value to them every day, making sure they're comfortable, making sure they're secure, making sure they have a good, safe experience so that they will, so that there's no turning back for them, so that they don't revert back to a cash-based lifestyle, that they remain our customers for the long term. So just some four key principles for you all. That wraps up my portion. I'll turn it back over to Abel, who will continue with the presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Lindsay. Basically now at this point, we have reached the end of our actual presentation, and right now we're going to take some questions from the floor. Before we start doing that, though, I just want to remind you how to ask questions in the first place. Basically, on your screen towards the bottom of the panel, there should be a rectangle with a series of icons. The Q&A icon is what you click on, and that would bring up the box where you can write in your question and send it to us. It's a good time to ask now as opposed to later, because as consultants, asking us questions later, not in this webinar, may actually cost you. So just a word to the wise there. All right, well, let's get into some answers now and try to get into some of the things, because we had some interesting questions posed to us. One of them came from an anonymous attendee who asked us, have you seen any strategies that differ from the normal reaction that have been more effective than cutting costs for the business? And I'd like to pose that to John to handle that question.
Thanks, Abel. I'm gonna broaden it a little bit as this is the first question, and just provide a little bit of context. And actually going back to the quote that Diego raised, never waste a good crisis. That's, of course, a Winston Churchill quote. It's like most historical quotes, it's badly interpreted by some. Politicians love to use a crisis to spend even more and drive us further into debt. But the spirit of the quote by Winston Churchill, and the spirit of the quote when it's used properly, is to say, let's use this crisis. This is our opportunity to make really tough decisions that restructure our business, that repurpose our business, decisions that, you know, internally, politically, were just too difficult to do in a normal time. Or we were so busy, all our managerial efforts were focused on growth that we just didn't have time to manage these changes. And so that's really the spirit of what we're trying to get at here. There's so many ways to look at cost cutting, and one of them, of course, is strategic. So how do you restructure your company in such a way that it's going to be more competitive? And this is that much more imperative when it's a disruptive crisis. Most economic crises, things don't change that much, just demand falls, and cost cutting tends to be evenly handed across the business. But in something like this, where, you know, retail is a great example. Your brick and mortar retail sales are zero, and your online sales are going through the roof. Well, that's an easy way to get very dramatic about cost cutting. Stop promoting, you know, your entire budget for conferences, your entire budget for in-store promotion, your entire budget that you pass on to the traditional distribution channels. Cut it, destroy it, and focus on online and other channels that are going to, you know, be strong not only today, but 6 months, 12 months after the pandemic leaves us. Another really interesting, I think, more on an HR motivational point of view that I lived through in the last crisis, the big one, the last global crisis, the 2007 and 8 financial crisis. I saw companies that would hold back on cuts till the last minute and then, you know, issue pink slips. But instead of doing all the pink slips at one, they'd do them sort of in waves, and their entire staff was left on eggshells for months. In that case, was a year and a half in total, waiting to see if they would get fired or not. Lack of communication. These are classic mistakes. The best example of sort of equitable cost cuts that I saw in terms of keeping people motivated was FedEx. In 2008, Fred Smith said, we're going to need all our people when demand returns. And so what he did was he took himself a 20% cut. He asked of sort of senior managers a 15% cut, middle managers a 10% cut, and everyone else a 5% cut. So everybody was in, everybody had skin in the game, everybody suffered a little bit for the crisis, but nobody was laid off. That's one way to handle it. That's certainly a good way to keep your people motivated, and the need to communicate cost cutting on the HR side is essential. Keep it transparent. But here, I think what we're saying is that's not enough. That because the external environment in which you operate is so changed by COVID, that you need to use this opportunity to reposition yourselves, whether it's narrowing the channels you go through, Instead of going to market with 8 products, 3 of which are premium, 3 of which are niche, and only 2 are core and value priced, maybe you go from 8 products down to 3, because those 3 are going to drive 80% of your sales. And you save on all the promotion, and you save on all the costs associated with bringing those other products to marketplace. To make those externally driven cuts that reposition your company for the future, you need to consult the marketplace. You need to constantly survey your customers and understand from them what's important. You need to follow the competition, particularly what we like to call local heroes. It is in times of crisis that often the local firms in Latin America who go to market without spending nearly as much on advertising, they spend much less on marketing in general. They're much more value price positioned. They tend to be more agile with their cost structures. They should be heavily studied. What are they doing to keep their costs down and still remain relevant to customers? It's typically local brands that do better in crises than the big international brands, which are best positioned to service the top 15% of customers. Another thing that we encourage people to do is to monitor regulations. How are regulations going to change? I guarantee that with the fiscal crisis under which almost every government in Latin America finds itself today, they will be scrambling to find new sources of tax revenue. They will not be able to cut their costs at the same pace that their tax revenue is falling. And whether they look to mining or energy or any of their most successful export industries, whether they look to financial transactions and taxing them, to the payment sector, credit cards and taxing that, we will see new forms of taxations, and companies need to be aware of that, either to prepare themselves or to team up with others in their industries to lobby against those changes. These are the sorts of things that you need to look externally. You cannot simply look internally for cost cutting. And that's really the seminal message that we're trying to transmit today, which is use this crisis to restructure yourselves for the new reality going forward, and do it in part by consulting externally your customers, your competitors, and the regulatory environment in which you operate.
All righty, thank you so much, John. I think that what John's points really underscore, and so that's sort of the main reason why we decided to do this webinar, is that there are a lot of strategic, creative ways to approach cost cutting that go beyond just reducing headcounts or doing these other things. So we thought it was important for us as a company, because we've seen this work in the past, constantly helping companies with this, to share this kind of approach to help people think about these things in a different way. And that's kind of the purpose of this webinar. It's a little different than our usual webinars where we kind of like focus on market data, but since this is part of our consultant area of expertise, we wanted to share that with you as well. So just to elaborate a little on what John was saying. Let's move on though, we still have some more questions to get to. There's one here that I think Lindsay might be able to help us with, because she's done a lot of research in the area of innovation on the financial services side. And so this question is, what are the factors that should be considered when cutting costs in the innovation department?
Thanks, Abel. Great question. The innovation department in and of itself is both a driver of change, meaning it requires investment, but it's also tasked with innovation in and of itself is doing things faster, doing things more efficiently. So it's a great place to look to cut costs. And the first thing I would look at is, how is your innovation center or innovation team structured within your organization? Are you in a silo, or are you well integrated with the rest of the organization? Any companies that are in silos will essentially have inefficiencies from a lack of communication, from tasks being done by 2 different teams, by having a really chunky and difficult decision-making process across the organization. So I would look at, how are you integrated with the rest of the organization? Are you circulating and flowing information freely across all areas of the organization? And are there any redundancies that you can potentially eliminate? Are you using agile working methodologies? This is true for the Innovation Center as well as the rest of the wider company. Agile is developed to save time, to make sure people are being used for what they're best at, and making sure you're not wasting efforts that are could be better allocated to someone else. So we've seen the most innovative companies be really successful at implementing Agile, and that having a direct impact on their time to market when launching new proofs of concept and product ideas. And then thirdly, I would say, look at what you can outsource. Particularly financial institutions they like to have their full developing team in-house. We've seen banks in the effort to become more digital, hiring armies of developers. This isn't necessarily the most efficient strategy because you have to onboard these employees, bring them into your culture, which is a little bit antithetical to a startup or development first, tech first culture. So how much of your development and design can you outsource at likely a much lower cost and in terms of time and money? So those were the notes I took down for that question. I think that is going to be your best bet. It really has to do with how you're structured and how you're most efficiently using your resources.
Alrighty, thank you very much. Now we have a question for Ricardo to field. It's from Francisco. He's basically asking us, considering the Latin American market reality, could you give us some examples of products and services which it could be lethal to diminish the client experience?
Thank you, El, and thank you, Francisco, for your question. Well, I'm going to tell some of the things that any company cannot do in trying to achieve overall excellence or performance excellence, achieving overall customer expectation or expectations of the customers. One of the things is ignoring the customer feedback. A lot of companies do research, and companies are unable to react, not even quickly, but sometimes they never react to key requests from customers. Second thing is making the customers wait a lot of time when they call to a call center. Another aspect that generates very low scores is when companies compromise the customer personal privacy of them. So this is some of the don'ts that can create, it doesn't matter what company or brand it is or what industry they are, but those are the things that should be avoided. And finally, some of companies invest in having, for instance, in their platforms or website, a chatbot to answer questions or customer experience questions. Sometimes they don't do anything. They just have a chatbot for the sake of having a chatbot. And according to the chatbot builders, this is the case of 90% of the companies that use chatbot for customer experience surveys. So it should be tied to actionable actions. So it must be actionable in the companies. Otherwise, it's going to be a waste of money and time. Thank you again, Francisco, for your question.
Also, Ricardo, since part of your area of expertise is in the area of artificial intelligence, we had a question that's related to that as well that I wanted to pose to you. And this question says that artificial intelligence is a real game changer in managing costs. What guidance can you provide to an SMB to introduce AI to drive costs down and also accelerate new habit adoption?
Well, thank you, Eva, for this very important question. If you are a small business owner, a lot of people think that artificial intelligence is like a magic thing. And I always say things like, in the world of artificial intelligence, imagine that you have a toy. Let's suppose a Lego toy. No? You have the Lego, you have pieces. You have to know what are the pieces that you need to select to build the solution you need. And with this, I'm going to answer another question about single moms. We need to build this using the analogy, we need to match or to link different solutions or technological aspects in machine learning to understand, explain, and predict consumer behavior. So in artificial intelligence is not like when we got a package like Microsoft and then you install it and you are on your way. No, you need to, in the cloud, there are many companies, or few companies, not many, few companies. There are like 4 or 5 global companies. They have solutions in the cloud where you can select those pieces so that you need to know what are the pieces that you need to choose and select to create in the cloud the solution in a specific to, in this case, understand your customer. I hope I answered the question. And a very important note, caveat I want to say is that you don't have to have a lot of money to get into the artificial intelligence solutions. Because most of the solutions resides on the cloud. So it's if you just use, or you can pay for whatever you use. So we can talk about it in a specific, because every industry, every company is different.
If I could just add to the answer regarding single moms, because this is a really interesting dilemma. In demographic studies that we've done over the years in Latin America, what we've learned is, and the demographics in Latin America have changed dramatically in terms of household structure in Latin America. Households have gotten smaller. People are moving out before they get married, young people. They're getting married at a later stage. The elderly, who in the past did not have much in terms of pension savings, moved in with their children. Many of them now are living independently. And in fact, the two largest demographic, or the two fastest growing demographics, are single mothers and the elderly living, or empty nesters living on their own. And those two demographic shifts kind of run counter to some of the proud traditions, family traditions of Latin American cultures. And so in many ways, they're kind of under-recognized by media, they're under-recognized by demographers and by marketers, but they're a reality. There's a higher percentage of single mother households in Latin America than there are in the United States, for instance. And there's almost no sort of consumer media magazines or specialized sources of information that track this group, in part because people underestimated their wealth. Because a lot of them work independently and work in informal markets, they are not picked up through the typical channels that monitor wealth and segments in any society. But what our survey showed was that they are prominent and they do have money. And now that they're shifting their buying online out of necessity, we're seeing the strength of their purchasing power. So the short answer is, there is not a reliable source of information that tracks either that segment or empty nesters, even though they are definitely two ascendant segments. And so you really have to rely upon your own surveys to understand these consumers, their preferences, and how they differ from other segments.
All right. Well, shifting gears to a different sort of question, one of the attendees is saying that he or she is thinking more in increasing income than cutting costs. And the observation that this person makes is that most countries are going to inject funds into the market to recover the private section. And so their question is, should companies find ways to approach the public sector to take advantage of that funding? So I'd like to pose that to Diego.
Thank you, Abel. This is a very interesting question. And this morning I was reading a very interesting fact that will help me answer this question. And I was reading that globally, governments have designed fiscal stimulus programs worth $11 trillion. That's basically half of the size of the US economy. And that's the money that the governments will inject into their markets to prop up the economy and to sustain some of the private sector. And definitely there are plenty of opportunities in the public sector. And some of the opportunities that come to my mind, I'm not only the practice leader for the logistics, but also for the industrial sector. And here are some of the areas where I believe there are opportunities in the next 12 months, for instance, agriculture. And recently I was working with a client producing PVC piping, and there were one of the largest clients for this producer was the government. And if we think about agri-food agriculture, there will be a need, for instance, to expand irrigation projects across Latin America. So there you have plenty of opportunities with the government in terms of the agriculture sector, and the way that the governments in Latin America are planning to modernize the agricultural sector to become more relevant in their economies. It's something that will definitely happen in the short to medium term. Also, when we think about, for instance, public hospitals, I was also working with a company that provides heating, ventilation, and air conditioning equipment. And nowadays, the quality of air, it's really important across hospitals, offices, public buildings. So there are plenty of opportunities to provide services and new equipment, focus on the quality of air and the quality of the equipment and the maintenance of the equipment, especially in the public sector. So another area of opportunity with the public sector is infrastructure. In the case of, for instance, Peru, close to 10% of its economy will be invested in fiscal stimulus projects that will definitely include infrastructure. So there will be opportunities there to sell and to expand the sales of construction materials, of services. So definitely looking at the public sector, how to approach the public bidding processes, identify the best ways to participate in those processes. Of course, corruption is rampant across Latin America. So knowing how to navigate, knowing how to understand the regulations, as John was saying, is critical in the months ahead to be able to benefit from these fiscal stimulus programs.
If I could just add a note of caution, there's a huge disparity between the countries in Latin America that have the fiscal firepower to actually go out and spend money towards the end of the healthcare crisis to try to revitalize their economies. Diego mentioned Peru. Peru is the fiscally strongest country in Latin America after years of prudent fiscal and monetary management. They have the lowest debt level in the region. The second would be Chile. At the other extreme, of course, would be Argentina, which is in no position to, fiscally stimulate. They got a bit of a break with the renegotiation of debt, but they're still going to be under tremendous fiscal pressure. Mexico, unfortunately, is also under tremendous fiscal pressure. Another country where we will see an expansion of infrastructure and public spending post-healthcare crisis will be Brazil. So it's important to understand the countries that can afford. Everyone wants to revitalize their economy with public spending, but very few can, or not very few, about half can afford and about half cannot. And then, like Diego points out, you've got to look and see if in your sector of public spending, is it realistic that you can win contracts in what is often a nepotistic, if not corrupt, environment.
All right. Well, shifting gears into a different area, I think this might be an interesting question for Lindsay. The attendee is asking, what are your preliminary projections on the use of factoring as a way of reactivating the economy, considering the primary industries in LATAM?
Great question. Thanks, Abel. So for those of you who don't know what factoring is a type of lending in which a company uses its accounts receivables as collateral. And so anyone in the B2B supply chain is in a good position to take advantage of factoring. And actually, we're seeing factoring being offered by an increasingly diverse number of companies. There are, usually our alternative lending companies, sometimes banks will offer factoring, but more and more we're seeing it being offered by ERPs and accounting software. These technology platforms that see your books and they know your history, they can see your account receivables, they can make calculations on how likely that client is to pay you, and then lend you money based off of that. So our predictions, our preliminary forecast for this is it's very emergent, very small still. There still is evaluating credit worthiness has been a chronic problem, but we have more and more startups leveraging different technologies to provide this capability. So my prediction for this is that yes, we'll see it be increasingly important, but more importantly, it's being offered by an increasing variety of companies. And if you are so the ERPs and those accounting platforms, CRM platforms that are often tied into your accounting are also a good channel. We see CPG and distributors being in a good position to offer this type of lending. So definitely something for everyone to keep on their radar.
Okay, thank you so much, Lindsay. There's another question that's on the technological side, which I think is interesting. I'm not sure which of the panelists feel most comfortable in addressing this one, but it is interesting. It's posed by Minor, and he's basically asking, is this the best time for Latin American companies to update to exponential technologies to cut costs and increase profits?
I'll take a shot at that. I mean, I think that really goes to the theme that has been addressed by, I think, everyone on the panel today, and that is, this is an opportunity to re-engineer your firm. And the fact is that most companies, well, I shouldn't say that, large companies have the luxury of being able to separate operating costs from investments. And they're not necessarily, on a day-to-day or month-to-month cash flow crisis management. And so larger companies right now can tap sources of capital, particularly for investment in technology, at the lowest interest rates they've ever accessed capital before. So there is opportunities for companies that have access to capital, and they won't be beaten up by shareholders if they show that they are investing in a technological shift of their business that is going to reduce costs and or position their firm better for the future. And they can separate that from the operational margins of their cost structure. However, it's really larger companies that have that luxury. Smaller companies typically don't have that kind of access to capital. So it's important to make that distinction.
Okay. Shifting gears again, I'd like to pose this question to Diego, actually. This is a more broader question, but he has experience in this area in terms of conducting some of the studies, helping companies with this matter, so that he may be helpful here in shedding light on it. And the question is, what strategies can cut costs and help a company grow?
If I think about logistics and industry, first area is looking at the competition, looking how the competitors are managing their vendors and the type of relationship that they're having with their vendors. Some companies may have very strict requirements to work with specific vendors. If we think about trucking, or if we think about warehousing or fulfillment services. So looking at what are the best practices implemented by the competition and the best-in-class competitors in a business segment is crucial to know how or where exactly where you're overpaying your vendors, and looking at also the rates that your competition is paying for the exact same services that you're paying for today. It's crucial to know if you're being too generous with your vendors, or if you're being too cheap and you're losing some of your vendors because you're not paying the right amount of money. So that's That's very important. And also conducting an internal exercise with the management teams to understand what are the areas that you think are not being profitable enough, or the areas that are not being agile or efficient enough, areas that you think that you can improve, or that your competition is killing you because you're not being efficient. So perhaps it's about pricing, or perhaps is your cost structure is not up to date with the market needs. So having those type of strategic sessions in your company to identify those areas where honesty needs to be at the forefront, to have this type of discussions. That's definitely something that can help and can give ideas to companies where you can cut costs. And when you start identifying those areas, cutting costs, I believe most people and most managers think about cutting costs just shrinking operations. And I want to be very clear that that's not the case. When we're referring cutting costs, is finding specific areas where you're not being efficient enough, when you're overpaying your vendors, or where you're paying too much for the services that you're using, and finding ways to renegotiate those rates with your vendors, or finding ways in which your vendors can become more efficient. That's where we think about when we say finding ways to cut costs, because of course, in times of crisis, sometimes some services and some products need to be cut from your portfolio, as John was saying. But it's also very important to don't lose sight of the growth that your companies will pursue as soon as the economy starts recovering, as soon as the consumers start spending more money. If you start shrinking your operation, you won't have the capabilities and the structure to go after those customers. But if you're efficient, if you're able to become more nimble and agile in your operations, you will be able to offer a better price to your customers. You will be able to offer a better service that will position your company as one of the leaders in your specific business segment. So that's my 2 cents for that answer.
Diego, also to build on your response too, isn't the fact that if you can strategically cut costs in that way by doing sort of that best-in-class kind of research, doesn't that then improve the cash flow so that a company can grow in a different area and invest in a different area? So therefore they are cutting and growing at the same time, right? If they take that cash and invest it, no? Wouldn't that be the next step?
Definitely, because as I said before, during times of expansion, companies tend to forget about the profitability, or not the profitability, but the efficiency of their operations, and they tend to overpay for some of the services that they're required from their vendors. So during these times of crisis, when we need to become more efficient and we need to lower our operational costs, basically companies will be able to grow in that way, becoming more profitable, becoming more efficient, and finding ways to invest in other type of technologies and other type of solutions that will be able to deliver the solutions that customers are looking for today. So that's definitely the case.
I just want to add also that one of the areas that frankly should be really looked at closely, and where a lot of cost savings can be made, and that is your marketing and sales business development and sales budgets, which for some companies are huge. If you think about it, some companies spend millions on attending conferences. And I've seen companies struggling to find ways to position money that they're not spending on conferences in other ways. You know, you're not going to be attending conferences. A lot of virtual conferences, from an attendee's point of view, where you're charged, frankly, the return on investment is pretty limited. And I think that companies are turning to develop their own conferences. So if they can't go and sell and demonstrate their product, if they can't go to trade shows and show their product, then they're setting up webinars. The problem with webinars is that if you think about it, in a conference, why do people go to conferences? They go to conferences to network, and they go to conferences because of the quality or the fame of the speakers. And third most important is actually the content of the conference. In a webinar, it's exactly the opposite. It's the quality of the content that attracts the audience. Then it's the delivery of the speakers. And third, and a distant third, is, you know, who else is attending the webinar. So companies, you know, can have to completely redesign their marketing budgets. And a lot of the face-to-face, whether it was travel or what have you, needs to be replaced by virtual models. And this is, you know, this is tough because we specifically work with a lot of marketing departments. But what we're finding is, and this is not simply a self-serving comment, but what we find is they're actually dropping their spending on research and other things that give them information from the marketplace. And they're continuing to spend on methods of marketing and sales promotion that frankly aren't working right now. And I think that it's a really tough re-engineering to undertake, but you can realize massive savings there and take those savings and apply it to virtual marketing methods that you've probably never tried before.
And John, maybe you can add a little bit about thought leadership. Now that you're talking about webinars and you're talking about this specific subject where companies want to, or before they use conferences to showcase their expertise, to showcase their knowledge in a specific services, specific business segments. Now, I believe thought leadership is becoming more relevant. So why don't you complement with the thought leadership?
You're absolutely right. If you're at a conference, typically a company would send its CEO or its president or its divisional president or somebody with a great deal of stature. And just by virtue of that person showing up at the conference, that would attract press, it would attract an audience, et cetera. In a webinar environment, there's a true democratization of who is speaking. And frankly, the best spokesperson in your company is probably not your CEO or probably not your president. And the stature that that person has and can project in a conference is much more difficult to replicate online. So why do people go online? They probably aren't going to go online to listen to the president tell you how great the company is. They're going to go online to be informed. We are living in an environment today where information is changing on a daily basis, whether it's related to the dynamic of the healthcare crisis or the dynamic of the economic crisis. And people are hungrier for information than they've ever been. So for companies to attract eyeballs into a webinar environment, it's not enough to put their most famous people behind the camera or in front of the camera. They need to develop content that doesn't say wonderful things about them, but demonstrates their knowledge of the sector, of a particular trend. And this is where companies like us develop content based upon researching the market. And people are hungry for that because we don't have the ability to go to conferences and meet customers and be out in the field and gather that kind of market information that our sales team and other market-facing people normally do. We therefore rely upon webinars and other sources of information to give us that information. So if you're going to go the webinar route, it's not enough to have a great speaker. You've got to have great content. And that's where, you know, a third party like ourselves can really help.
Yeah, because that really helps take the temperature of the marketplace. And in fact, when you conduct the webinar itself, even something as simple as we were doing with the polls, companies can do that in different ways in order to understand market conditions. We do it to develop materials and to sort of have a give and take with our audience, but other companies can use that more just to actually gather intelligence in addition to other tactics that could be employed in that sense. We've done, of course, as we've spoken about recently, the consumer snapshots, which is just another way to do a quick study to understand what's happening as the market changes rapidly. And that's something that the crisis, I think, is forcing a lot of companies to do. You have to take that temperature read quickly in order to be able to adjust your tactics as things keep changing. And that's just a part of the times that we're living in right now. In any event, to get back to another question that we have here, this one's going to be a little broader and more general. And this has to do with Latin American culture, which I think is pertinent to address here. What the attendee is pointing out is that in LATAM's financial system, sometimes our own organizations have a very hierarchical, traditional, and silo-oriented structure, which are obstacles to innovation and actually cost-cutting in a way that's different, outside of the box, so to speak. So that person is asking, what ideas and suggestions would you share to minimize these corporate culture limitations?
I can speak to that, Abel. To kick us off, we've actually done a real deep dive into this question in one of our projects that we'll actually be launching in partnership with our client in about a month. So it'll all be available publicly. But I can speak to some high-level thoughts there. Ruben, thank you for the question. So you're absolutely right. We see hierarchical, traditional, silo-oriented corporations slowing innovation. When we look at the most innovative companies against some of the more traditional companies, the number one difference is how the company is structured. And I would say one of the key findings that innovative companies have is does your average employee feel empowered to raise an idea and escalate that idea? And if they do feel empowered, do they know how to escalate it? Do they have a clear channel? Do they know who to go to? Can their idea be channeled in many ways, or is there just one person in front of them who could easily kill it or bottleneck it? So the first thing is to look at your organization and see how ideas are flowing and see how vertically structured it is. And if the average employee who might see a lot more on the day-to-day than your top executives, do these guys have the power and the inspiration the permission to bring their ideas to the table? That would be, one key thing to look for. It's a whole discussion, long answer to the question, but it's a good place to start.
Okay, does anybody else have any other comments on that one in terms of helping cultural changes happen in this regard?
Well, just to mention that this is not a Latin American problem. This goes on around the world. The fact is that most corporations are siloed. They have different P&Ls within them, whether it's by product, by region. And if it is by product and part of your distribution calls for the destruction of one of your core products over time, and we have on the panel Ricardo Alvarez, who worked at Kodak. Kodak invented digital photography, but they didn't take it very far because it would have killed their core business. So it's a problem that all corporations have, and frankly, not many are good at running their core business and really giving liberty to an innovative division to do its work. Most large companies innovate by buying small companies and allowing those companies to flourish even at the expense of their core products. It's really tough to build an innovation culture within your company. And as Lindsay points out, if you are going to try, it has to include, and this is where actually the patriarchal structure that is found in Latin America is helpful. If the patriarch or the owners families of these companies is really gung-ho behind the innovation, then that will help break through those silos and get people, and we've seen that with some of the banks where either the founding patriarch or his son or daughter sort of took on innovation as a pet project and was given the political power inside that bank to really make those changes, which might not have happened in a publicly traded, non-family owned company.
Okay, well, we have another question that's related to some of the research that Ricardo presented earlier in his presentation. John alluded to some of this as well, but I think it's an important one to go over once again. And what this attendee is saying is, knowing that the single mothers are driving the economy today, what would be the resource of information of choice to understand their current needs and behavior?
If you are a small business and if you have in your database the list of your customers being women and the demographics, you might know who they might be, a mom or single mom. It depends of the level of granularity that you have in your structured data. But today you can use on the structured data, again, I'm with the same aspect talking about it, because if you have a call from a mom, you must be able to have the permission to record that conversation. And by the voice, by using other information of your existing customers, the tone of voice, if you have videos or pictures of what they share in social media, those informations are very inexpensive, but very hard work that gives you an idea or a portrait of who they are. And this is kind of free for you because it's your data. And this is a good starting point to generate the information on your existing customer base. Today, there is a lot of information and there is an abundance of information everywhere. And having information is not a problem. The problem is how to choose the right information that is going to give me the quality to make a business decision. And that's why we always tend to recommend the usage of the new technologies. That's what would happen. I don't know if other members of the panel have a different angle on a different answer to this very good question.
Just repeating what I said before, and that is there's not a lot of good published sources out there of this segment, which is really emerging recently. And one has to conduct one's own survey work. But as we know, and as we've provided to clients recently, online surveys, which are now much more widely accepted in Latin America, including this emerging segment in terms of online engagement, it can be quite inexpensive and quickly done. And we've helped out lots of clients in that regard.
Yeah, and to John's point, that is very helpful in terms of being able to get a quick understanding of the market. So you'd be able to understand how much of your customer base are these single mothers, and then you'll be able to adjust not only your products but your marketing messaging to reach those folks if indeed they make up a significant majority. What we observed in our own study was a little bit more general, but I'm sure any number of different companies and products can find that they do have a lot of these single mothers as customers, and maybe they've never thought about adjusting their messaging that way, and that could very well increase their sales, but it comes down to taking that next step to find out and sort of see what's going on. Well, to address the next question is one with regarding security. It's actually two questions we're going to sort of combine here for expediency. So one is asking us about the perspective of security in the region in this environment of the pandemic, and if there are opportunities for businesses offering security solutions. And then related to that is with COVID-19 is how much do we think COVID-19 will bring about a change in the global political area?
I'll take a shot at that. In Latin America, COVID began as a healthcare crisis and is now, I would say, in a larger scale, an economic crisis. And that economic crisis is a result of really the only policy tool that most Latin American governments had, and that was the use of widespread quarantines to try to control the virus. But those quarantines, particularly where they have been strictly enforced, Central America, Colombia, Argentina, are having the most damaging impact economically. Across all of Latin America, but particularly in countries where a high percentage of employment is informal. In Colombia, I believe it's around 60%, Peru, it's around 70%. Central America, it's similar numbers. In Brazil, it's less, it's probably 40%. Mexico, it's about 50%. Those informal jobs, most of them cannot be transferred to your home into a virtual environment. And if they can, a lot of people don't have enough connectivity or the right devices to make their work function from home. Most people in Latin America connect to the internet on a cell phone, which is not a way to run, a business virtually. So what is happening, unfortunately, is one of the side effects of COVID economically is the most economically divided region in the world, i.e. Latin America, is going to be more divided a year from now than it was 6 months ago. Because it's the poor who are being harder hit than the professional classes. The professional classes, by and large, can switch their jobs to home, can work virtually. So that has two ramifications. Security-wise, we've already seen the rise in theft, in break-ins, in robberies, particularly in neighborhoods that are hard hit, whether it's in Buenos Aires, in Bogota, in some Central American cities. And that's going to be a rising thing, because those countries, Argentina, Colombia, and most of Central America, also don't have the fiscal fiscal resources to provide the kind of direct payments to the poor that Peru has successfully done, that Chile has done to some degree, that Brazil has done to some degree. So we anticipate security issues in a lot of these countries. And politically, we know that when incomes, we've seen this and we've actually studied this for some big companies, when income distribution worsens, then politics turn populist. When income distribution improves, then politics tend to be more pro-business. And there's no question that income distribution is worsening. So there will be political pressure to be more populist than ever in Latin America. So not a hopeful answer, but I think a realistic answer to both of those questions.
Okay, thanks so much, John. Another one that I wanted to tackle before we run out of time here, it's a very specific question, but that's sort of the nature of what our discussion is that because we have our practice leaders who handle specific areas, we get both broader and specific questions. And there's one that I wanted to pose to Lindsay because I thought it was an important one, is drilling down in the payments area. And it's basically asking, what's the best way for small merchants to cut costs and payments, which are very expensive?
Thanks, Abel. Yeah, very important question. Right now, we're seeing more small merchants than ever come online out of a necessity to sell and stay in business under COVID, but they do face very high fees. I would say, right now is the best time to do an excellent job serving your small merchants. And marketplaces like Mercado Libre, Rappi, Pedidos Ya, and others have been really instrumental in bringing these guys online with quick onboarding. They don't have to build their own store. They don't have to have technical expertise. They can do it instantly, almost instantly, and increase their sales. And that's been a driver over the past 2 years and even more accelerated now under COVID. In conversations we've had with small merchants, especially restaurants and bakeries and things like this, there's a bit of a backlash because of how expensive these platforms are. And at the same time, we're getting more and more tools for small merchants to sell directly through social media without needing a platform behind it. And the social media is free. So Instagram and Facebook, even WhatsApp being #1 platforms for small businesses where they can advertise their product, maintain a relationship with customers. Really the only thing that's missing is that payment to finalize the journey, and more we're seeing solutions being available to those guys to move away from the marketplaces. So I think we'll start to see this trend. Also, we're seeing more models being available for small merchants to build their online stores in a really effective, easy, and cheap way. So the marketplaces have been very popular. They've really helped with the digitization process of the small and informal sector. As these guys become more empowered, we may see a backlash moving more towards a more proprietary model.
All righty. Thank you so much, Lindsay. Well, I
Thank you.
think we're now almost to the end. We've kind of gone over time. I think we have one final question to answer, and I think it'll be time for us to wrap up. Thank you all for your participation with this. It's been really interesting to get all of your perspectives, comments, and questions. So this final question is, again, sort of sector related. It is, do you foresee a big positive impact in the health services for LATAM, depending on the specialty? The person who posed the question is in the hearing aid amplification technology dispensing health sector, and they're observing that now everything's being changed due to internet sales.
I can speak, I don't know too much about that specific sector. I think a lot of it will depend on how much regulation enables telemedicine and the sale of equipment directly to consumers online. In Brazil, we're already seeing regulation adapting to enable telemedicine and digital prescriptions. So this is yet another part of the economy that is being driven towards digitization. We see companies preparing for telemedicine and getting ready to accommodate this trend. So, definitely an acceleration in that area. I think it will depend a lot on regulation. Not sure if anyone else has a comment there.
Yes,
Well,
actually, I want to,
Go
John,
ahead,
if I may, I want to talk about a very specific example on how the pandemic has revolutionized the healthcare sector. I'm Colombian and most of my family are living in Bogota. And yesterday I was talking to my mom about telemedicine, and she gave me an example that was astonishing for me, and I didn't believe it was going to happen very soon in Latin America. She said that my sister was having a conference with her doctor about a specific acne issue that she had, and the doctor prescribed to her a couple of medicines, and he sent digitally the prescription to the private insurance, and the private insurance 1 hour later approved the prescription, and the medicine was delivered to her at her apartment the next day. So if you ask me last year, is this possible in Latin America? I was going to say for sure, no, it was not possible. But today is happening because all the efforts that the governments have been doing to stop the spread of the virus, they have been pushing doctors, they have been pushing several sectors and industries to go online, to go digital, to facilitate interaction with customers. And now we're seeing that doctors are taking prescriptions digitally, and consumers are receiving those prescriptions at home the next day. So that's a concrete example of how the healthcare sector has been revolutionized in the case of Colombia, for instance.
Yeah, no, it's remarkable. And Colombia is probably the leader in telemedicine in Latin America. Another thing that we picked up in the survey that we conducted a month ago that Ricardo led, and that was that not only, the big takeaway is people were buying a lot more online, but another thing was that people were that much more worried. Now, when you're stuck at home, and for a lot of people, they had less time dedicated to work, so they could spend a little bit more time being introspective. And part of that introspection was being more conscious of decisions they make around their health. And there was a lot more, if you look at what people are searching for product-wise online, if you look at what, digital products they were purchasing, a lot of them were health-related. A lot of them were related to, conducting exercise in their home. The largest one of the biggest product sellers in Latin America and in the United States during COVID was barbells and other pieces of workout equipment. So people are concerned about their weight, they're concerned about their health. They recognize, part of the messaging that I think Latin Americans receive around COVID is that you're not just vulnerable if you're above a certain age, but you're also vulnerable if you have diabetes, if you're overweight, if you have hypertension, if you are vulnerable to heart disease. And a lot of these are are infirmities that it can be mitigated, can be lessened through self-discipline, through change of lifestyle, more exercise, change of diet. And so there's a real heightened awareness of those health trends and wellness trends. And we're seeing a change also, not in the whole population, but those who can afford to go out and buy those products, whether it's vitamins or exercise equipment or digital yoga programs or what have you, those have been growing quite dramatically under COVID. And I think that's partly driven by the level of awareness that is being heightened by COVID.
Yeah, there's no question about that. And certainly telemedicine is something that's been slowly gaining ground in Latin America via the chat feature. If you guys can see that out there, it should be available there on your screen. It'll bring up a message. I sent it out to you just a second ago. Basically, you can just email me, adelgado@americasmi.com. Our sister company, Global Health Intelligence, tracks hospital care in Latin America. And so we'd be able to send you some information on telemedicine in Latin America if you're interested in that particular aspect, because that company did a webinar on this back in April. So there'll be a lot of fresh data that we could send. All right. Well, we're just about done here. The final thing here, we don't have any other questions, of course, but our last comment is from Nathalie Bernal, and I did want to address that since she was kind enough to write about us. And she was just basically agreeing with our point about the need to take marketing virtual, talking about how she wanted to share with the other attendees, in fact, how she and her company have had success doing this, creating virtual trade shows and things like that. And that certainly seems to be the direction that the market is headed in. Certainly you have to go more virtual. And to John's point, it is about having speakers that are a little bit more dynamic than perhaps a lot of the C-level people might be. They may be good, they may not be good, but what John is correct about is that the quality and the presentation of the content is what is going to drive forward. And that can be difficult for companies to do. And that's something that we've been helping other companies out with, just as an aside, because if it's not your area of specialty, it's very difficult to gather that information that you need to gather to take a position on an industry and help guide people as far as things are concerned. And that's what a lot of the webinars are there to do. And that's what's going to bring in the attendees and further your brand's positioning. In any event, that kind of wraps things up for us. If you want to continue the conversation here on the screen, I'm showing you our attendees, our panelists' contact information. You can reach out to them and share your thoughts. And maybe there's a way to continue the conversation a little bit further and see what we can do to help your company in terms of this difficult environment and help you with more creative cost cuts. All right, well, I think that does it for us. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you being here, and we hope that you can join us at our next webinar soon. Take care.